The soldier's return and the lion who never forgot. The dirt road stretched before Thomas Mason like a weathered scar across the landscape he once called home. 10 years, 10 long years since his boots had touched this soil. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees that lined the path to his village. Trees that seemed both familiar and strangitaller now, their branches reaching higher into the cloudless sky. Thomas adjusted the weight of his rucksack, feeling the ache in his shoulder, a companion that had followed him home from the war. His uniform hung loose on his frame. The war had taken more than just years from him. His once vibrant eyes now carried a depth that spoke of things seen and unseen, horrors witnessed and battles fought in lands whose names most villagers would stumble to pronounce. The distant silhouette of his childhood home appeared on the horizon, sending a surge of emotions through his battle-worn heart. How many nights had he dreamt of this moment? How many times had the thought of return been the only light in the darkness of conflict? And yet, Thomas found himself slowing his pace as he approached the edge of the ancient forest that bordered his family's land. This forest held memories some of his most precious from before the war swept him away like autumn leaves in a storm. He paused at the tree line, his calloused hand resting against the rough bark of an old oak. The war had changed him, hardened him, but in this moment, vulnerability seeped through the cracks of his soldier's armor. Would anything be as he remembered? Would anyone? Home, he whispered, the word feeling foreign on his lips. The forest seemed to whisper back, the gentle rustling of leaves carrying echoes of his youth. Thomas closed his eyes, allowing himself to remember. It was in this very forest, a decade ago, that he had found Leonidasa lion cub, barely 3 months old, whimpering beside the body of its slaughtered mother. The poachers had fled at the sound of approaching patrols, leaving behind their kill and the orphaned cub. Something in those amber eyes had spoken to Thomas, reflecting a fear and loss he understood all too well. His father had called him foolish. A lion is not a dog, Thomas. It's a wild creature that will turn on you the moment its nature calls. But Thomas had been stubborn. Perhaps he had seen something of himself in the cub's something lost, something fighting to survive. He had built a sanctuary at the edge of their property, spending months nursing the cub to health, teaching it to hunt, preparing it for a life that would eventually return to the wild. When the call to war came, Leonidas had grown into a magnificent young lion, his mane just beginning to fill out. The goodbye had been silent Thomas standing at the gate of the sanctuary, Leonidas watching with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand more than any animal should. "I'll come back," Thomas had promised, not knowing if war would make him a liar. Now, 10 years later, Thomas wondered what had become of his lion friend. Surely Leonidas had long since returned to the wild, had perhaps even forgotten the human who had once saved him. Lions didn't live so long in the wild, did they? The thought brought an unexpected pang of sadness. Thomas took a deep breath and continued walking, following the overgrown path that led deeper into the forest toward home. The familiar sounds and scents awakened memories long buried beneath the thunder of artillery and the cries of the wounded. Here, a stream where he had taught Leonidas to catch fish. There, a clearing where they had rested under summer stars. Lost in reflection, Thomas almost missed the subtle change in the forest's rhythm, the sudden silence of birds, the stillness that fell like a veil around him. He stopped, his soldier's instincts pulling him from nostalgia into sharp awareness. He was being watched. Thomas stood motionless, his breath held captive in his lungs. Years of combat had taught him to recognize the weight of a predator's gaze. His hand moved instinctively to his side, searching for a weapon that was no longer there. He had left that part of himself behind, or so he had hoped. A rustle came from the dense undergrowth to his left. Thomas turned slowly, muscles tense, mind racing through possibilities and escape routes. The foliage parted. And there stood Leonidas. Time seemed to suspend itself as man and beast locked eyes across the small clearing. The lion was magnificent, larger than Thomas remembered, his golden mane full and regal, framing a face marked by the years. Scars adorned his powerful body, telling stories of battles fought and survived in Thomas's absence. But it was the eyes that held Thomas transfixed, the same amber eyes that had looked up at him from a frightened cub's face all those years ago. Eyes that now studied him with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the layers of time and change. Thomas felt his heart thundering against his ribs. Would Leonidas remember him? Or had the wild reclaimed all memory of human kindness? Would the lion see him as nothing more than prey? Leo, Thomas whispered, the childhood nickname escaping his lips before he could consider the absurdity of addressing a wild predator as one might an old friend. The lion made no sound, no roar, no growl. He simply watched, his massive chest rising and falling with each breath. Then, in a movement that sent Thomas's heart into his throat, Leonidas began to move forward. Each step was deliberate, powerful, the patting of his paws against the forest floor a soft counterpoint to Thomas's racing pulse. The distance between them closed with agonizing slowness. Thomas remained rooted to the spot, a strange calm washing over him. If this was to be his end, there was a certain poetry to it to be reunited with a piece of his past, even in death. How many times had he faced death on foreign soil, among strangers? At least here, he was home. 10 feet? 5 feet? 3? Leonidas stopped directly before Thomas, his head level with the man's chest. They were close enough now that Thomas could feel the heat radiating from the lion's body, could smell the wild on his fur, could see the individual scars that mapped the creature's journey through the years. Time stretched between them like a thread pulled taut, ready to snap. And then, in a gesture that shattered the last of Thomas's composure, Leonidas lowered his massive head and closed his eyes. It was a gesture of such profound trust, such unmistakable recognition, that Thomas felt tears spring unbidden to his eyes. Trembling, he raised his hand and placed it gently on the lion's mane, fingers sinking into the coarse hair. "You remembered," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. "All this time you remembered." The forest seemed to hold its breath around them. This soldier and his lion reunited against all odds. Thomas sank to his knees, eye level now with Leonidas, whose gaze never wavered. How strange that in this creature's eyes he found more understanding, more recognition of who he truly was, than he expected to find in the eyes of the villagers who had known him since birth. "I've changed," Thomas told the lion, as if Leonidas could understand the weight of confession. "The war, it changes you, takes pieces you never get back." Leonidas blinked slowly, a gesture that Thomas had once read signified trust among cats. The lion's scarred face told its own story of survival, of battles fought and won, of a life lived by nature's harsh rules. "You've had your own wars, haven't you?" Thomas said softly, noticing a particularly deep scar that ran from the lion's shoulder down across his flank. He wondered what battles Leonidas had faced in the dark of the forest, what victories and defeats had shaped his years. Slowly, Thomas rose to his feet. "I should get home. They're expecting me." His parents' letter had reached him 6 weeks ago, just as his service was ending. "Come home, Thomas. The war is over for you now." To his surprise, when he began walking along the path toward the village, Leonidas fell into step beside him. Thomas glanced at the lion uncertainly. "You can't follow me into town, Leo. You know that." But the lion continued walking alongside him, matching his pace with a regal stride. There was something both comical and deeply moving about it as if Leonidas were a comrade escorting him home from battle. They walked together until the trees began to thin and the first outlying fields of the village came into view. Thomas stopped at the forest's edge, looking out at the patchwork of farms and the distant cluster of buildings that formed the village center. Smoke rose from chimneys, and figures moved about their daily work, a scene of such ordinary peace that it seemed to belong to another world entirely. "This is where we part ways," Thomas said, turning to the lion. "You belong to the forest now." Leonidas stood perfectly still, his amber eyes fixed on Thomas with an intensity that made the man wonder, not for the first time, how much the creature truly understood. Then, in a movement of surprising gentleness, the lion pressed his forehead against Thomas's outstretched hand before turning and disappearing into the shadows of the forest. Thomas watched the space where Leonidas had vanished for a long moment before shouldering his pack and stepping out into the sunlight. The village had changed little in his absence. The same slate-roofed cottages, the same central square with its ancient stone well, the same church whose bell had marked the hours of his childhood. Yet Thomas felt like a stranger walking through a familiar dream. Faces turned toward him as he passed, some lighting with recognition, others clouding with uncertainty. "Thomas? Thomas Mason, is that you?" He turned to see Mrs. Harris, the baker's wife, her hands white with flour, her face lined with years he hadn't witnessed. "It's me," he confirmed, attempting a smile that felt stiff on his face. "God be praised. Your parents said you were coming home, but—" She wiped her hands on her apron, studying him with eyes that didn't quite hide their shock at his appearance. "You're so changed." Changed. The word echoed in his mind. If only she knew how deep those changes ran. "War does that," he said simply. Her expression softened with pity that was new too, being the object of pity. "Well, you go on home now. Your mother's been baking since dawn. Says she's going to fatten you up proper." Thomas nodded his thanks and continued toward the edge of the village where his family's farm stood. Each step closer to home brought a confusing mix of anticipation and dread. Who would he be here? The soldier? The son who left? Or someone else entirely a stranger, wearing familiar skin? The farmhouse came into view around the bend in the road-whitewashed walls, blue shutters, the oak tree in the yard now significantly taller than he remembered. His pace slowed involuntarily. A movement at the door caught his eye. His mother appeared on the porch, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. The moment she recognized him, she flew down the steps with a speed that belied her years, crying out for his father as she ran. Thomas dropped his pack as she reached him, her arms encircling him with a fierceness that spoke of 10 years of fear and waiting. She felt smaller in his arms, more fragile than he remembered. "My boy!" She sobbed against his chest. "My boy has come home!" His father appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on a cane that was new. The older man's face, lined and weathered, crumpled with emotion as he hobbled forward to join the embrace. Home. He was home. The thought seemed to require constant reaffirmation. That night, seated at the kitchen table that had been the center of his childhood world, Thomas struggled to bridge the gulf between the life he had left and the one he had returned to. His mother served his favorite dishes, each plate a memory made tangible. His father asked cautious questions about the war, sensing the darkness that lingered in his son's measured responses. "And what will you do now?" his father finally asked, the question that had been hovering unspoken throughout the meal. Thomas looked down at his handsaw soldier's hands, calloused and scarred. What did he know how to do now except fight? What place was there for him in this peaceful world? "I thought I might rebuild the old sanctuary," he said, surprising himself with the answer. "At the edge of the forest." His parents exchanged a look he couldn't quite interpret. "The lion sanctuary?" his mother asked hesitantly. "But surely that old lion is long gone by now, Thomas." Thomas thought of Leonidas's amber eyes, of the gentle press of the lion's forehead against his palm. "He's not gone," he said softly. "He's still there, still remembers me." His father's eyebrows shot up. "You've seen him? After all this time?" "Today, in the forest. He walked with me to the edge of the village." His mother's hand flew to her mouth. "Thomas, that's dangerous. Wild animals." "He's not." Thomas paused, searching for words to explain the connection that defied rational explanation. "He knows me, Mother, and I think I need this. Need to care for something. Need to heal something. Need to remember that not everything touched by violence is destroyed beyond redemption." His father studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "The old lumber is still in the barn. You can use whatever you need." That night, lying in his childhood bed that now felt too small, too soft, Thomas listened to the distant sounds of the forest through his open window. Somewhere out there, Leonidas was moving through the darkness, a golden phantom among the trees. Tomorrow, Thomas decided, he would begin rebuilding. Dawn found Thomas at the edge of the forest, surveying the remains of the sanctuary he had built a lifetime ago. Nature had reclaimed much of its vines crawled up the weathered posts. Part of the roof had collapsed under the weight of accumulated seasons, and small creatures had made homes in its abandoned corners. Yet the foundations remained solid, a testament to the care with which the young Thomas had constructed this place. He ran his hand along a wooden beam, remembering the day he had set it into place, Leonidas watching curiously from the shade. "We'll make it better this time," he murmured to the empty structure. He worked through the morning, clearing debris, measuring what could be saved and what needed replacement. The physical labor felt good, purposeful, in a way that differed from the desperate exertion of combat. Here, he was creating rather than destroying. By midday, Thomas had cleared enough space to begin actual reconstruction. He was balancing on a beam, hammering a support into place, when he felt that familiar sensation of being watched. Turning carefully, he saw Leonidas sitting at the edge of the clearing, observing him with what Thomas could almost swear was curiosity. "Came to inspect the renovations?" Thomas called out, smiling despite himself. The lion blinked slowly, then rose and padded into the half-rebuilt sanctuary. He moved with deliberate grace, sniffing at corners and posts, as if reacquainting himself with a forgotten place. Thomas descended from his perch, watching as Leonidas completed his circuit of the structure before settling in a patch of sunlight near where Thomas had been working. "I'll take that as approval," Thomas said, returning to his task. They fell into a strange companionship as the day progressed. Thomas working, occasionally speaking aloud his thoughts about the design improvements, and Leonidas watching, sometimes dozing in the sun, sometimes disappearing into the forest, only to return hours later. As sunset approached, Thomas gathered his tools, satisfied with the day's progress. Leonidas rose and stretched, a magnificent silhouette against the dimming light. "I've got to head back," Thomas told him. "Will you be here tomorrow?" As if in answer, Leonidas moved to the sanctuary's entrance, then looked back at Thomas before slipping into the forest shadows. The days fell into a pattern. Thomas would arrive at dawn, tools in hand, provisions in his pack. Most days, Leonidas would appear at some point, sometimes bringing the remains of a hunt gesture that Thomas interpreted as the lion's contribution to their shared project. The villagers soon learned of Thomas's unusual companion. Some came to see for themselves, standing at a safe distance while Thomas worked alongside the lion. Their reactions ranged from fear to awe to skepticism. "That beast will turn on you one day," warned old Mr. Peterson, who had lost livestock to predators over the years. "You can't tame what's wild at heart." Thomas didn't try to explain. How could he make them understand that he wasn't trying to tame Leonidas? That perhaps it was Leonidas who was helping to tame the wildness that the war had planted in Thomas's own heart? As summer turned to autumn, the sanctuary took final shape stronger than before, with a sheltered sleeping area, a feeding station, and a large open space where Leonidas could come and go freely. Thomas had incorporated a small lean-to for himself as well, a place where he could sit during rainstorms or spend the night when the darkness fell too quickly for a return to the village. It was during one such night, as rain drummed against the roof and thunder rolled across the valley, that Thomas experienced his first night terror since returning home. He awoke gasping, the sound of artillery fire still echoing in his mind, the smell of gunpowder and blood so real he could taste it. Disoriented, he stumbled from his bedroll to the open door of the lean-to, gulping the rain-fresh air. Lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating the sanctuary and Leonidas, who lay watching him from the dry space beneath the main shelter. Their eyes met in the darkness. Without conscious thought, Thomas moved from his lean-to to the main structure, sinking down beside the lion. Leonidas shifted slightly, making room, the heat from his massive body providing comfort against the chill of the rain and the colder memory of war. "Dreams," Thomas explained unnecessarily, his hand finding the lion's mane. "Just dreams." Leonidas rumbled softly, a deep vibration Thomas could feel through his palm. They sat in silence as the storm passed, two survivors finding solace in the simple presence of the other. When morning broke clear and bright, Thomas returned to the village carrying something new within him, a fragile seed of healing that had taken root during the night's communion with Leonidas. His mother noticed the change at breakfast. "You look lighter today," she observed, studying his face with the careful attention only a mother can possess. Thomas considered this. "I think I'm finding my way back," he said after a moment. "Back from the war?" "Back to myself." She reached across the table to squeeze his hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "That lion," she said softly, "I thought you were chasing ghosts when you started rebuilding that place. But maybe he's helping me chase away ghosts," Thomas finished. As autumn deepened toward winter, Thomas completed the sanctuary and began spending more time in the village, helping his father with the farm and reacquainting himself with community life. Yet he still visited the sanctuary daily, sometimes bringing meat from the butcher for Leonidas, sometimes simply sitting in companionable silence as the lion dozed nearby. The villagers gradually grew accustomed to the unusual friendship. Children would beg their parents to walk them past the edge of the forest, hoping for a glimpse of the soldier and his lion. Thomas became known as something of a local legend, the man who had gone to war and returned with the trust of a wild beast. "It's like something from the old stories," he overheard Mrs. Harris telling a customer at the bakery. "A sign of God's grace, if you ask me." Thomas wasn't sure about God's grace, but he knew there was something profound in what he and Leonidas had found, something that transcended the expected boundaries between human and animal, between the civilized world and the wild. Winter arrived with a vengeance, bringing the heaviest snowfall the region had seen in decades. Thomas worried about Leonidas, despite knowing that lions were adaptable creatures. He made the trek to the sanctuary daily, breaking trail through snow that sometimes reached his knees. On one such visit, as a particularly fierce blizzard approached, Thomas found Leonidas huddled in the shelter, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "This isn't good for you, old friend," Thomas murmured, kneeling beside the lion. While Leonidas's thick mane offered some protection, his desert-adapted body wasn't meant for such extreme cold. Making a sudden decision, Thomas gathered the blankets from his lean-to and wrapped them around his pack. "You're coming with me," he told Leonidas. To his surprise, the lion followed him without hesitation as they made their way through the gathering storm toward the farm. His parents' expressions when they opened the barn door to find their son accompanied by a full-grown lion were a study in astonishment. "Just until the storm passes," Thomas explained quickly. "He's not made for this weather." His father stared at Leonidas for a long moment before nodding slowly. "The back stall is empty, but Thomas, this is not a house cat." "I know what he is," Thomas said quietly. They created a comfortable space for Leonidas in the barn, with plenty of straw and blankets. Thomas spent most of the blizzard there with him, reading aloud from old books by lantern light while the storm raged outside. Occasionally, his parents would brave the short walk from house to barn, bringing hot food for Thomas and meat scraps for Leonidas. On the third day, as they brought lunch, his mother paused in the doorway, watching as Thomas sat beside the lion, one hand absently stroking Leonidas's mane while he read from a dog-eared copy of The Odyssey. "I didn't understand before," she said softly, setting down the basket of food. "Why you needed to rebuild that sanctuary, why you spend so much time there." Thomas looked up, waiting. "But I see it now," she continued. "He anchors you, brings you back when you drift too far into the shadows." Thomas felt his throat tighten. His mother had always had a way of seeing through to the heart of things. "It's not just that," he admitted. When I found him, he was alone, vulnerable. I gave him protection when he needed it most." He glanced at Leonidas, who watched the exchange with those intelligent amber eyes. "Now, he does the same for me." His mother nodded, unexpected tears shining in her eyes. "War took my son," she whispered, "but that lion is helping bring him home." When the storm finally broke, leaving the landscape transformed under a blanket of pristine white, Thomas led Leonidas back to the sanctuary. The lion paused at the forest's edge, looking back toward the farm before following Thomas to their shared refuge. The winter passed, and with it the worst of Thomas's inner storms. The night terrors came less frequently. The sudden flashes of combat memory faded in intensity. In their place grew a quiet strength, a capacity for peace that he had feared permanently lost. Spring brought new life to the forest birds returned, building nests in the trees surrounding the sanctuary. Wildflowers pushed through the softening earth, and the days grew longer, filled with gentle sunshine. Thomas, too, found himself blooming with the season. He began helping neighbors with repairs and construction projects, his skilled hands in demand throughout the village. Some evenings, he even joined the younger men at the tavern, sharing carefully edited stories from his travels. Yet he never spoke of the darkest moments of war, those he saved for Leonidas, who listened without judgment as Thomas finally gave voice to the horrors he had witnessed and participated in. There was something purifying about confessing these things beneath the open sky, with only a lion as witness. "I don't know why it's easier to tell you," Thomas said one evening as they sat at the entrance to the sanctuary, watching the sunset paint the forest gold. "Perhaps because you won't look at me differently tomorrow." Leonidas blinked slowly, stretching out to his full, impressive length beside Thomas. "Or perhaps," Thomas continued thoughtfully, "it's because you understand something about survival against odds, about doing what must be done." The seasons turned one into another. Thomas expanded the farm with his father, adding new fields and improving irrigation. He became a respected figure in the village, no longer defined solely as the soldier who had returned, but as a man of skill and character in his own right. And always there was the sanctuary and Leonidas. The lion grew older, his mane taking on streaks of silver, his movements becoming more deliberate with age. Thomas, too, felt the passage of time in the occasional ache of old wounds when rain threatened. They had been together for nearly 5 years since Thomas's return, when he noticed Leonidas growing thinner despite his regular meals. The lion slept more, his once boundless energy now carefully conserved. Thomas recognized the signs with a heaviness in his heart. "You've had a good life," he told Leonidas one summer evening, sitting beside the aging lion in their sanctuary. "A long one for your kind." Leonidas regarded him with the same steady gaze that had greeted Thomas upon his return from Waragaze, that seemed to hold wisdom beyond what any animal should possess. As autumn approached, Leonidas's decline accelerated. He ate less, slept more, and sometimes struggled to rise. Thomas began spending nights at the sanctuary, sleeping beside his old friend under the stars. It was on one such night, as the first leaves began to turn golden, that Thomas awoke to find Leonidas standing at the sanctuary's entrance, looking out toward the deeper forest. "Leo?" Thomas called softly, rising from his bedroll. The lion turned to regard him, then looked back toward the forest with unmistakable intention. Understanding dawned slowly. "You want to go?" Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. Leonidas waited, watching him. With a heart that felt simultaneously leaden and fragile, Thomas moved to the lion's side. "I'll go with you," he whispered, "as far as you'll let me." Together, they walked into the forest, moving slowly to accommodate Leonidas's weakened state. The lion seemed to have a destination in mind, leading Thomas along paths unknown to human feet, deeper into the wild heart of the woods. As dawn broke through the canopy in dappled patterns, they reached a small, hidden clearing carpeted with soft moss and surrounded by ancient trees. Leonidas moved to the center of this natural cathedral and slowly lowered himself to the ground. Thomas stood for a moment, understanding washing over him in a wave of grief and acceptance. Then he sat beside Leonidas, placing a gentle hand on the lion's mane. "Is this where you want to stay?" he asked softly. Leonidas exhaled deeply, his amber eyes meeting Thomas's one last time, a look of such profound connection that Thomas felt it like a physical touch against his soul. They remained there as the sun climbed higher, bathing the clearing in golden light. Thomas spoke quietly, reminiscing about their years together, the orphan cub, the rebuilt sanctuary, the healing they had found in each other's presence. As midday approached, Leonidas's breathing grew shallower. Thomas lay down beside him, his arm draped over the lion's massive shoulder, feeling the gradually slowing rhythm of his heart. "Thank you," Thomas whispered, tears flowing freely now, "for remembering me, for helping me find my way home." When the last breath left Leonidas's body, it was with a gentle sigh that seemed to merge with the forest sounds around them. Thomas remained beside him until sunset, saying goodbye to the creature who had saved him in ways no human could have understood. 5 years later, Thomas Mason stood at the edge of the forest, watching as his young daughter explored the rebuilt sanctuary. At 35, he had found a fullness to life he had once thought impossible: a wife who understood his silences, a child who brought light to his darkest corners, and a community that had embraced him fully. "Papa, tell me again about Leonidas," Emma called, her small hand tracing the carved wooden plaque that hung at the sanctuary's entrance. Thomas smiled, joining her. He was a lion who never forgot kindness. He began, the familiar story flowing easily now. "And when I came home from the war, lost and broken in ways that didn't show on the outside, he remembered me." "Even though you were gone for years and years?" Emma asked, her eyes wide with wonder, though she'd heard the story countless times. "Even then," Thomas confirmed, "he helped me remember who I was beneath the soldier, helped me find my way back to myself." Emma considered this with the solemn thoughtfulness of a 6-year-old. "Do you think he's watching us from lion heaven?" Thomas looked toward the deeper forest, toward the moss-covered clearing where Leonidas rested. "I think a part of him is always here," he said softly, "in the forest, in the sanctuary, and in us when we remember him." Emma nodded, satisfied, and skipped toward the sanctuary's interior. Thomas remained a moment longer, feeling the gentle breeze that stirred the leaves, a breeze that, just for an instant, seemed to carry the rumbling purr of a lion who had once walked beside a wounded soldier and shown him the way home.